2025年4月26日，梵蒂冈举行了庄严肃穆的国葬，悼念刚刚辞世的教宗方济各。各国元首云集哀悼，向这位深受敬爱的宗教领袖致上最后的敬意。在庄严气氛下，有两位人物的短暂交锋，意外成为全球媒体关注的焦点。这两位就是在今年228发生过不愉快会谈的美国总统川普以及乌克兰总统泽伦斯基。根据国际媒体的报道，美国已经向俄乌双方提出一份最终和谈提议。白宫强调，如果俄罗斯与乌克兰无法迅速就此方案达成共识，那么美国将准备退出这场和平谈判。美国国务卿卢比欧在接受媒体访问时也明确表示，美国不会连续数周或数个月继续这种努力。他警告俄乌双方，川普总统很可能很快就会转向其他优先事项。表面上，美国的施压似乎让俄罗斯与乌克兰必须紧速回到谈判桌，和平看似近在眼前。然而，川普的期待最终仍落空。普丁一如既往展现出愿意谈、乐意谈的姿态。他多次对外宣称，对任何和平倡议都持积极态度，希望基辅政权也能保持同样感受。而泽伦斯基也积极表态支持和平。在 Telegram 上，他写道：乌克兰一再表示不排除任何能够实现停火，并进一步实现真正和平的方式。但面对美方提出的最终提议，泽伦斯基态度却显得坚决。他在4月22日基辅举行的简报会上表示，没什么好谈的，提案违反了乌克兰的宪法。
Я погоджуюсь з президентом Трампом, що у України немає достатньо зброї, щоб зброєю повернути контроль над півостровом Крим. Але у нас є можливості санкційні, у світу є можливості іншого економічного тиску, дипломатичного тиску, щоб говорити це, обговорювати територіальні питання, але тільки після повного безумовного припинення вогню. Тимчасово окуповані території, вони тимчасово окуповані. Вони всі належать Україні, українському народу. Україна не буде визнавати юридично будь-які тимчасово окуповані території. Мені здається, що це абсолютно справедлива позиція. Вона законна з точки зору не тільки Конституції України, хоча передусім, але і з точки зору міжнародного права.
相较这些表面上的善意，暗地里的盘算，让急于促成停火的川普总统看起来像是被玩弄了。究竟俄乌双方谁才是真正拖延和平的黑手？
We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process.
The London talks stalled after Zelensky pushed back on a part of the U.S. plan that included Washington recognizing Crimea as part of Russia on Wednesday. Under the latest U.S. proposal, Russia would get U.S. recognition of their control of Crimea, recognition of Russian occupation of other key regions, a promise Ukraine will not join NATO, lifting of sanctions, and improved economic relationships with the U.S. Ukraine would get a robust security guarantee and European-led peacekeeping forces, the return of some land, access to a key river, and compensation and assistance for rebuilding.
President Trump questions now whether Vladimir Putin really wants a peace deal. In a post on Truth Social, he questioned whether he's being strung along by the Russian president. Trump wrote, here's part of it, "It makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's just tapping me along." Well, this follows Trump's 15-minute meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky just before the funeral of Pope Francis.
It is a shift, and it appears to be also maybe even a strategy if we look at what he's been saying recently about Ukraine and on Russia. But there is a big difference between saying something, or in this case, posting about something on Truth Social and doing it. But this is quite remarkable to have President Trump saying that he's beginning to question whether Russian President Vladimir Putin wants an end to the war in Ukraine, because only a day before this comment he said that both Ukraine and Russia are very close to a ceasefire deal. He called on both countries to meet for a very high level talks, and he posted that post on Truth Social only after this conversation between Russian President Putin and Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff, unfortunately.
So what does this meeting between Trump and Zelensky mean for Ukraine?
Could be the beginning of some kind of a resolution to the deadlock we've been seeing in the last days. We've had Trump really lash out at Zelensky, saying he's the harder man to deal with, that he's the man who's extending the killing fields. And this shift in tone would be seen pretty positively and as a possible step forward. But just to paint that context for you briefly a little bit, we have had officials be quite tight-lipped from all sides, but there have been multiple media reports. These have said that the U.S. has rejected Russia's demand for Ukraine to withdraw from 4 regions, rejected Russia's demands for Ukraine to demilitarize, and there's been no objection to Ukraine pursuing an EU membership. When it comes to NATO, Zelensky has said that he would accept Article 5-like guarantees from Western allies, but those territorial concessions remain a sticking point. However, Ukraine has said, we will talk about this after a full unconditional ceasefire. So there may be some wiggle room. Ukraine will call the recognition of Crimea as Russia unconstitutional and rejects it, but there could be a way to freeze the lines. Now, in October 2022, right after the war, there was a decree here in Ukraine banning such talks, but Zelensky has also expressed a willingness to negotiate in any format, as he puts it, after an unconditional ceasefire. So a best-case scenario may actually have some kind of an initiative towards that as well.
The President Trump, told Time magazine that Crimea will stay with Russia. The president speaks about Russia tapping him along as if that's some revelation. Starmer, Macron, they've been saying that for months now. So are they really any closer to a deal?
Yeah, here's where we get to the hard part. The 2 proposals, the one put forward by Ukraine and Europe and the one put forward by the U.S., which feels like it was dictated by Vladimir Putin, are very far apart. The current U.S. deal would basically allow Russia to keep everything it's holding, Crimea, but also the current territory that it's occupying, and have very few security guarantees. Ukraine wants reassurances. They want NATO troops on the ground, but individually represented, not under the banner of NATO, to make sure that Russia can invade again. And the White House hasn't fully embraced that yet. So will this moment of goodwill lead to any changes in those proposals? I did speak to one Ukrainian official earlier this week who was briefed on the talks, and they said, look, it doesn't look good, but this is what happens in negotiations. You bring the 2 impossible wish lists together, and then you start bargaining. Before this, we didn't even have anything written down from the U.S. administration. Now we have something to work from. And I think you also might see a signing of a mineral deal as soon as this week to keep that momentum going and to keep Trump thinking, hey, Ukraine is actually working with us. It's Moscow that's working against us.
Yeah, also coming this week, the 100-day mark, and that marker might also offer some urgency to get something accomplished that you can say you did within the first 100 days.
很多人认为， 普丁迟迟不愿和谈，是因为战争打得越久，他可以从中获利更多。但眼前美国提出来的最终协议都是依他所想的去拟定的，他还想要什么？所以普丁真心希望这场战争没完没了吗？其实普丁很早就明白表示，他拒绝与泽伦斯基谈判的原因有2个，其中之一是法律上的僵局。2022年，当克里姆林宫宣布吞并乌克兰的4个地区顿内茨克、卢甘斯克、赫尔松与扎波罗热的时候，泽伦斯基随即就颁布法令，明定在这样的情况下不得与普丁进行任何谈判。这条红线直到今天都未曾撤回。于是即使川普再怎么积极斡旋，只要这条法令存在，任何形式的双边谈判都很难有其正当性。也因此，克里姆林宫发言人佩斯科夫曾公开质疑，谁有资格参与这场目的在结束3年战争的和平谈判。即便俄罗斯对乌克兰释出的谈判善意，表面上仍表示相信，但同时也冷淡回应，细节始终未曾改变。另外一个理由则是，战争期间，普丁还是完成了俄罗斯国内的选举，以压倒性优势再度掌权，而泽伦斯基以战时戒严为由，全面暂停原定于2024年春季举行的乌克兰大选。在普丁眼中，这样的泽伦斯基已不再代表最新民意，是过期的总统，跟他进行任何形式的谈判，对普丁来说都是政治上的自降身价。这不仅是外交上的难堪，更是对他个人权力正当性的挑战。因此，俄乌想要和谈，恐怕首要条件必须是换掉泽伦斯基。
So the last week has really been about figuring out how close are these sides really, and are they close enough that this merits a continued investment of our time as a mediator in this regard.
Certainly when we look at the ceasefire proposal that the US is putting forward to these two sides, and we don't know the content of it, but we are now coming to the understanding that a lot of it is rooted in the idea of borders, of land and territory and control, and particularly in Ukraine, that is domestically a very sensitive issue. President Zelensky campaigned for that job, saying that he would never, for example, cede Crimea to Russia, and yet that is something that is now being suggested for peace. And what we have here in Ukraine today is one of the country's most powerful politicians, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of this city, who I sat down with yesterday to talk about whether or not Ukraine should consider giving up some of its land. And he said, temporarily, he thought that perhaps they should. And we discussed whether or not those US talks are really moving these two countries any closer to a ceasefire.
Do you think that Ukraine will have to give up territory to reach a ceasefire?
It's a very difficult political decision to give up our territory to Russia. It's not a solution. It's not fair.
Would you consider it if it brought peace?
It can be difficult decision for President Zelensky. He have to find solution. It will be a painful solution for the peace. But I guess we never accept occupation of Russia.
But the pressure at the moment from the US seems to be that they want Ukraine to give up territory to try and end the war. That's what they think the solution is.
Right now, we doesn't take a solution. Right now, a lot of conversation about possible solution. And one of the scenario, what you say is to give up the territory. It's not fair, but for the peace, temporary peace, maybe it can be solution, temporary.
You've got this senior politician, high profile, saying something that most Ukrainians have resisted saying up until now, that maybe it's time to concede at least something to Russia. How is that being received? Talk a bit more about that.
Well, Natasha, this really does speak to the war fatigue that Ukrainians are experiencing. And even during that interview with the BBC, Vitaly Klitschko said it would be something that would be a very difficult choice, that even if some Ukrainian territory was conceded to Russia, it would be something that the majority of Ukrainians would never actually accept. But it does suggest that Ukrainians are starting to look at the current situation, as you mentioned, Keith, yesterday, experiencing one of the most aggressive bombardments in several months at the hands of Russian drone and missile attacks. And so you have a very popular, a very powerful mayor of the capital, someone who has been a vocal opponent of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, saying, listen, maybe we should look at this, maybe it might have to happen.
历史定位向来是执政者无法抗拒的诱惑。对普丁来说，这场战争的核心不只是领土的得失或制裁的松绑，而是一场历史性的对决。他要的是一个胜利者的姿态，我赢了，美国和北约输了。这不只是克里姆林宫的战略目标，更是普丁个人的政治遗产。而若川普未能洞察普丁这份盘算，那么普丁、泽伦斯基与川普的三角死结恐怕将持续拉锯。但问题是，世界会一直为乌克兰买单吗？普丁真的能无限期等待吗？背后的力量恐怕已在悄悄转变。就在华府焦头烂额推动和平谈判的同时，北京正静静摆好自己的棋局。表面上，中国一再呼吁和平，声称支持主权与领土完整，但私底下，他更在意的是美欧在这场战争中消耗到什么程度。中国不排斥介入调停，但条件是，当所有人都累了，他才是那个能定调新秩序的人。换句话说，中国不急助让战争结束，他更希望战争能为自己创造出转圜与牵制的空间，甚至拉拢俄罗斯，加重美国的战略负担。所以，一旦背后的牌桌换了玩家，战争逻辑也将全面重写。川普面对的不只是东欧战火，更是一场全球新秩序的权力卡位战。而在这场看不见硝烟的对决中，谁才是真正操纵棋局的人？这场战争的终点，也许从来就不在基辅或莫斯科，而是在北京与华盛顿之间。